This is a look at how I've made this sculpture of an alien creature come to life surface-wise using sprigs and sprig molds to give it some kind of an interesting identity. Somewhat decorative, somewhat organic. So here's a scan of a very early sketch that I did some time back, and this eventually became what it is now, what I've turned it into. But starting out with a sketch, thinking about how something moves, what its general proportions are, that's where I begin. This isn't an explanation of how I've hand-built this whole creature. We're just starting with a point where it's already mostly made. I've thought about the musculature of this thing underneath, its gummy, slightly amphibious toes, and how those would sit against the ground. And all of the raking across that surface that you can see that I've done with a serrated rib. That's all figuring out the muscles and how this thing moves about. Because to understand how these sprigs should sit on the surface of the skin, if they are indeed part of its skin, I wanted them to move in a way that worked with the movement of the body itself. So I sculpted that whole thing out, and I'm adding a few more pieces to this. Notably, these folds of skin, I'm going to be adding more underneath, just giving it a more floppy appearance. You can see I've built up around the feet. Again, that muscular body underneath, but then this flabby excess of skin over the top. And then the sprigs will be on top of that level of skin. So here you see all of the sprig molds that I'll be using for this project. They look like plaster molds, but they are actually bisque molds, slightly whitish because they're made out of porcelain. It doesn't have any tooth to it. Use that to make those bisque molds. So stronger than a plaster mold would be. Those can sometimes crumble. I don't want to lose any of that detail. So these are bisque molds. So all of those forms that you're seeing indented into those surfaces will be inversed, will be positives that will be laid across the surface of this creature's skin. So I'm getting close at this point, close to the stage where I'm ready to add the sprigs on. I have all of this extra skin folds and segments attached. And so now I've made a couple of these sprigs. They're not pristine when they come out of the molds. There's some cleanup work yet to do, but I don't do that before I apply it to the body itself. So you'll see there's gnarly things happening on the surface here, some textures I don't want, but I've applied the sprig to the head first and this other one over here to the shoulder before I'm cleaning anything up too much. Because if you clean up the whole sprig after you've taken it out of the mold, and then you have to apply pressure to stick that back down onto something else, you're likely going to distort another detail or another texture. I would just wait, unless you absolutely have to clean those up until it's on the surface that you're going to be altering. So with this one, this is a way that I sometimes work with sprigs. If they're giving me trouble staying together, I'll allow that excess piece of clay that I told you I'd scrape off of the rib typically, I'll leave that on this as a sheet to back the whole sprig, and then I'll wrap that over the surface. So not as cleanly cut as you see back here with the counterpart to it. It's opposite on the other shoulder. Has this excess clay. I get a good grab, I stick this all down, and then I remove that and I clean it up afterwards, just using hand building techniques. So there it is, much more cleaned up, and then you see the addition of more sprigs all over the surface. Now I'm going in with a needle tool, I'm redrawing certain parts. Just because you have a sprig mold configured one way does not mean that you can't combine it with other things on the surface and then alter them. So that's what I'm doing here. There's several different kinds of sprigs that I'm using, and I'm fusing them together, sticking bits of clay in between, and then retooling them, going over with wet brush to make it look consistent. Lots of freedom when you're working with a sprig mold, so don't just pop that thing out, stick it on the surface, and call it a day. Try playing around with it some. Maybe you'll find a more interesting form than what you started out with initially. These are small sprigs, so again, an example of where I've left that backing of clay on it so that I can handle these more easily than if that tiny little tail had come out on its own. It would probably break off. So leaving some clay behind just to keep it strong until I'm ready to apply it. More progress, more retooling. There's the sprig, one particular sprig out of its mold. But in case you haven't worked this way before, that's how it goes. Put the clay in, you pop it out, and you have a duplicate. Here we have the alien creature with the sprigs now attached. I have to consider with something like this how those sprigs will serve the piece, because this is a sculpture. This isn't a functional object. With a functional object, say, like one of my chemistry sets, one of my Jasperware chemistry sets, I'd just be thinking about these as decorative elements on that surface. With a creature like this, it's supposed to be some kind of organic life form. I have to think about these sprigs as a part of its body. So they're like aberrations, growths on the skin of this thing, almost between a growth and a tattoo. They work with the surface of the body, and they should move with those muscles that I had outlined earlier on. So thinking about the placement with something like this is a little bit different than just, say, a regular old functional teacup or something along those lines. Once I figured out what I thought this alien was, what I thought its environment was, and all of that, then I could place these, think about its movement, then think about the color pattern, which we'll move on to next. You'll see in the color stage that I'm going to really play up a contrast between these sprigs and the body, so they look of the body and yet jump out to the eye. So this is porcelain, this sculpture, and there it is after it's been totally fired. I've bisque fired it and then taken it up to a high fire range to mature that clay body and to get it nice and strong. Don't want it weak underneath it. Want it to be a strong sculptural object. But that's the way that it looks without any kind of a surface treatment whatsoever. Just blank. Nothing but contrasts of shadows to show you what's going on there on the surface. But here's the next step. I begin by selecting a coat pretty close to what I want that base to look like in spray paint. I spray paint the whole entire surface, so that's one thing that you're not seeing here between this and the prior step. And then what I've done right before this photograph was taken is I've rubbed in a contrasting darker tone of green into this whole thing. So wherever you're seeing shadows being picked up along the sides of the sprigs, or darker mottled blotchy green across the surface of this that's giving it depth, that's an additional paint on the top. So high fired, then go in with the acrylic paint to get a good coat over everything. The spray paint over the whole thing, and then acrylic paint rubbed in and rubbed off, giving it that contrast. Almost looks like a jade object at this point. Looks good, but that's really not what I was looking for, so we're going to continue the next step, which is adding color to each of those sprigs. I decided that I wanted to go with a pink, a reddish pink, to go against this green, to contrast this green of the skin. So I begin with these sticky globular feet down at the bottom, then move upwards, so beginning with that sprig right there, and then I'll move on throughout the whole body, as you'll see. But I thought there was an interesting contrast and attractiveness to this pairing of colors. So I start with one flat color, as you see here with this darker pink, and then I'll go back in on top to highlight all of those areas, get complexity and depth, just like I did to the body underneath. You can see the contrast of this flat one coat sprig on the top versus, say, this cluster here or the feet. Those have the additions of the lighter values of pink put in on top, making it look deeper ultimately. So there's the back finished. I want this to look from some angles as if it's entirely flat to the body, and then as you move around the object you realize that this is dimensional. It's a relief, a bas relief, a shallow relief on the surface. So I have areas where it is the sprig sticking out noticeably from the skin of the creature, but then I trail that off with the paint to make it look as if it's right there on the body. It's a part of the skin. So skipping ahead, this is what it looked like when I got through all of that painting process, where those trails have the same amount of depth as the sprigs do. There you can see the direct front and back view of this creature. Something unsettling about the way that it looks, and yet it's a little bit cute too. Want this dichotomous balance involved with it, and so that's what I've gone for with this color. You're drawn to the attractiveness of these pinks, but then you investigate a little bit further and almost looks like tumorous growths along that surface. It doesn't look exactly pleasant. You'll also notice there's a wet sheen over the whole body. I wanted it to look slimy and somewhat amphibious, so I've gone over that with a clear lacquer coat. Helps protect all of the paintwork I've done underneath. It also gives it that surface quality, the amount of reflectance that I want. So here we have the finished sculpture on the left, and then also a color study I've included on the right-hand side, imagining how this thing would react and move on all fours, as well as rearing up on his hind legs, thinking as a two-dimensional thing and as a three-dimensional thing. So I'm always working cross materials as I'm coming up with these works, but ultimately, in the end, it's a porcelain sculpture, hand-formed with sprigs, and then it's been spray painted, it's been rubbed with acrylic paint for contrast, hand painted in all of those sprigs and details, and then lacquer coated over the top for protection. So there it is. There's using sprigs on a sculptural form like this alien that you've seen here.